Back in 1999 or 2000, something like that, after the second round of NATO expansion in Europe, Bill Clinton and Vladimir Putin, Clinton coming to the end of his presidency and Putin just at the beginning, they had a meeting and Vladimir Putin floated an idea that's actually kind of sensible. He floated the idea of what if Russia were to join NATO? Now, do keep in mind, this is the year 2000, roughly, 99 or 2000. I forget, it doesn't matter. It was around that era. And Putin floated this idea. And if you think about it from the Russians' point of view, it's a great idea. Because you see, if Russia joins NATO, if there is an alliance that basically stretches from the Urals to the North Sea, then all of a sudden, all the security problems of the European peninsula get resolved. If they're all in the same military alliance, what all the nations of this alliance can do is spend more money and time and attention on their militaries and have greater trade and contact with one another because they're all on the same side. See? Yeah, that's what happens. When you have everybody's on the same side of a military alliance, very quickly, you don't need the weapons that you need to fight one another because you're all on the same side. And of course, you can devote more time and effort into trading and growing your economies and just becoming just all closer intertwined. It's a good idea. It was a good idea from the Russians' point of view. But what's interesting was what Clinton's reaction was. And many people have commented on it. Clinton's reaction, Bill Clinton's reaction at the time, was kind of like almost shock and horror. And he kind of I'll think about it. But it was really like, a brush off. I mean, instantly, instinctively, he knew, just like that there was no way that Russia would ever realistically have a chance of joining NATO. And so you have to ask yourself why. Why is it that Bill Clinton so, abruptly slammed the door on a very reasonable possibility? In point of fact, a possibility that had it happened, we wouldn't have the problems we have today. Had it happened, we'd probably have a much more prosperous European peninsula, all across the peninsula, but that's for another video. The point, why did Clinton slam the door so completely on a fairly reasonable request, idea, concept? And the answer is very obvious if you start to look at what NATO actually is. You see, NATO is not a military alliance. NATO is the largest market for American weapons manufacturers. You see, companies like Raytheon, General Dynamics, General Electric, all of them, all the weapons manufacturers, they need to sell what they're producing. They sell it to the American government, of course. But they also sell it to America's allies. Because you see, America's allies, if you're in an alliance with the United States, you have to buy American weapons. That's the sine qua non of the relationship. And the reason is, the purported reason, of course, is that everybody has to have the same weaponry so we have interoperability. So we can plug out one and plug it someplace else. So that we're all using the same equipment, the same communications equipment, the same guns, the same howitzers, the same aircraft, the same jet fuel. If it's all the same from the same manufacturers, then it's easy to, plug and play kind of thing, right? That's the rationale. But that's just a rationale. The real reason is by entering an alliance with the United States, you who joined NATO, you, a little country in Europe, joining NATO, you have to buy American gear. But see, what happens if there is no enemy? Then all of these governments start asking, why are we spending so much money on this American gear? We don't really need it because there's no enemy. Look around. We're in this alliance and it's great and we parade around and do these little exercises, but we don't have an enemy, a military enemy, so why are we joining up? Why are we spending so much money on all this gear that we don't need? And then you start to realize that, of course, NATO needs an enemy because that's the only way to justify the expense that all of these nations have to incur insofar as American weapon systems. If Russia had joined NATO, which would have brought peace to the European peninsula. Had Russia joined NATO, all the countries of NATO would have decreased their military spending, low as it is, and the United States would have decreased its military spending on NATO. Why would it spend more money on NATO if all of a sudden all the countries in Europe are on the same team? You see? And so it was because of the lobbying pressure of the weapons manufacturers that Russia could never become a part of NATO. Russia always had to be the boogeyman. Because if you have a defensive alliance, you're defending against something. What is that? You need an enemy. And so Russia was the designated enemy. And because Russia was the designated enemy, this justified spending all kinds of money on weapons, not just in the United States, but also in the countries of the NATO alliance. And as all these countries spent more and more money on weapons for the enemy, Russia, I mean, they didn't say it was Russia, but who else is around? Nobody, right? All the other countries in Europe were part of NATO except Russia, right? So if you know, you're sitting at a table and everybody else is part of a military alliance, and they say, no, it's not you, it's not against you, it's just in case, and you're the only odd man out, what the hell are you going to be thinking? You're going to be thinking, all these fuckers, they're getting ready to hurt me, to invade me, to do God knows what are they going to do to me. And so you arm yourself. Of course you do. And as you, in this case Russia, arm yourself to defend against this alliance of all these different nations, these nations all of a sudden having an excuse of like, oh, look, he's arming himself, so we better arm ourselves. And who wins? The weapons manufacturers. If you understand what NATO was, what NATO still is, as a matter of fact, it's just a way to sell more weapons. And by the very fact of buying more weapons, it creates enemies and justifies its existence. And that's why we're in the problem that we are in now. I mean, this was inevitable. And in fact, many smart people, much smarter than me, pointed this out. George Kennan, the architect of the whole containment policy in the post-war period, in the 90s, he warned precisely against this. He said that NATO has to be disbanded because it was creating its own enemy. And that's what's happened. And that's why we have this proxy war over Ukraine that's really a war between NATO and Russia. And this is a disaster, and we are flirting with nuclear war. We really are. And people don't seem to realize it. And the people who do realize it, they're like saying, oh, it's no big deal. I mean, some crazy people are actually saying that it would be good for climate change to have a small nuclear war. I mean, dude, right? Anyway, that's for another video, but I just want to point this out. See, the whole point of NATO is to have an enemy so they can make money. That's the point of NATO. And once everybody got armed to the teeth, that just scared the Russians into arming themselves, and it became a self-reinforcing cycle. If you understand anything of NATO and the current conflict, understand this. It was self-created. It could have been avoided. The whole mess that we are in could have been avoided were it not for the greed of the weapons manufacturers and the weakness and despicableness of Bill Clinton.